This episode is brought to you by Exceeder. Exceeder provides life science startups with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to accelerate R&D and commercialization. Lease the equipment you need with Exceeder. Extend your runway, hit your milestones. Request an estimate today at www.exceedr.com.
Welcome to the Biotech Startups Podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi.
My guest today is Stephanie Sirota, Partner and Chief Business Officer at RTW Investments, a full lifecycle life sciences investment firm dedicated to solving the most challenging unmet patient needs. Steph is a seasoned expert and a leader in business development, strategic partnerships, communications, and investor relations, managing RTW's relationships with key partners, which includes banks, academic institutions, corporations, investors, and NGOs. Before RTW, Steph served as a director at Valhalla Capital Advisors, a macro and commodity investment manager. Steph also worked at Lehman Brothers' New York and London offices, where she advised on merger and acquisitions, IPOs, and capital market financings, with a focus on cross-border transactions for the firm's global corporate clients. Over the next 3 episodes, we cover a wide range of topics, including Steph's childhood, her journey from investment banking to the buy side, her initial exposure to the biotech sector, and partnering with Rod Wong to grow RTW from a small firm to a major investor in the life sciences industry. Today, we'll chat about Steph's upbringing, covering her early exposure to different cultures, her background in competitive tennis, her time at Columbia University, and how these experiences helped shape her career. Without further ado, let's dive into this episode of the Biotech Startups Podcast. Steph, it's so good to see you again. And thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast.
My pleasure. It's great to see you again, too. I look forward to today.
Awesome. And so just, we were thinking about fun places to start in our conversation here. And as we were doing our homework, we wanted to turn back the hands of time and kind of just start in the very early days. And myself individually and my team included, we were curious kind of what was your upbringing like and how has it, influenced your leadership style and business philosophy?
Okay, so we're going that early. Yeah. It's interesting. I'm an only child. My father was older and very indulgent, and also always spoke to me as an adult. And my mother was very caring and very close to me, and she's Italian. My father was American. So I spent, a good chunk of, my youth being pretty coddled. But my parents really took me wherever they went. So we spent quite a bit of time in Europe in summers. I was lucky to have exposure to a lot of things, but I was also around adults a lot of the time. And I think that made me, and maybe part of it was innate, but because of these circumstances, because where I sort of found myself, I became an observer and I became a good listener. And I listened to conversations. I listened and I learned then that you can learn so much more when you hear people asking questions. You learn more from the questions than actually from the answers. And that became one of the ways that I approached my life, whether in school or as I pursued, areas of interest. I was very much an observer and I tried to soak everything in. I was never really impulsive. And I think that's really served me. Well. And then, I ended up becoming a very dedicated competitive tennis player. So my preteen and teen years were really dominated by sport. And I think I already kind of had the maturity and the mindset of an athlete because I understood, I think there is a certain maturity and a discipline that you need for that level of commitment. And I had that. And that was also very important. And competing in tennis and then traveling as a tennis player. I mean, I played in across the U.S. I played in tournaments in Europe. I played in South America. I spent actually almost 9 months in Argentina.
Wow.
When I was 15. So I did a year of school there. A year of school, I say that lightly. I played a lot of tennis, and I managed to sort of get accreditation for the school that I did do. But that was really important and critical to my development, because I understood the art of competition. I also realized that you're not going to be your best every day. So I had to draw on other things to be a good competitor. And I think that really translates also, when I look back on it now, on those times now, I realized that toughened me up. I feel like I can live through a bear market like the one that we're experiencing now. I think about, so much more than just the immediate, what is my task at hand.
Absolutely. There's so many directions I want to go. First, I'm also an only child. So I had a similar experience following my parents on international trips. But I got to say, like, looking back, I was like, dang, I was a brat. I was like, I couldn't appreciate it in the moment. I was like, I just want to go hang out with my friends. Can I go do that? But now in hindsight, I'm like, wow, I would not have had this, like, what an eye-opening experience to see different places, different cultures, just different situations, and just kind of being a sponge and soaking that up. Because when now we kind of fast forward, and now you have so many things kind of going on, comparatively speaking, to your childhood or adolescence. I'm like, Mom, Dad, could you redo that? Can I follow you on these trips again? I would love that.
100%. And I did not appreciate it at the time. And it was a drag. And I appreciate it now, though.
Yeah, totally. And I empathize with the kind of the grind that it requires to be, focus on a sport. So I played lacrosse growing up, and it was kind of a very similar thing with the traveling and everything of the sort. And I guess my question to kind of dig into the tennis kind of portion, the tennis era, was this driven by kind of you inherently wanting to play tennis, or was this something that was kind of cultivated via your parents?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I think so many times when kids are really good athletes and super into a sport, it is driven by the parents. In my case, I kind of fell into tennis sort of accidentally. It was a summertime pastime. I was at a tennis camp, and I happened to be pretty good at it. I had good hand-eye coordination, and I liked it. It was fun. I think I won the trophy at my camp. And I wanted to keep playing. And that was really the beginning. I found my own, passion. I loved the sport, and I guess I was very motivated. So I think about this too a lot in the context of even, my work today, or even just in my life. I've always looked at, failures or shortcomings as a challenge, and I think I certainly did that in tennis. So I was probably 11 when I kind of fell in love with tennis and decided that I really wanted to dedicate myself to the sport and give up everything else. And that was late because a lot of the kids that I was, meeting at these tennis tournaments on the weekends had been already, competing, and they had been playing 5 days a week since they were like 8 years old. And that wasn't my case. So I had to play catch up. But I was really driven. And I also kind of learned that when you love something, it doesn't feel like work.
Yeah. And that completely resonates with me. So in the Bay Area, growing up in Berkeley, lacrosse, I was introduced to lacrosse in probably like middle school, but there were like neighboring cities and schools where exactly what you said, they were getting started like as toddlers. And having that kind of element of playing catch up, like I was in middle school, they had been playing for 5 years ahead of me, was really kind of like lit a fire for me personally. But I really like I think back on that athletic experience and how it's kind of sharpened like the kind of work ethic and kind of problem solving that I carry to till this day. Which was that a kind of a similar experience for you as you were, playing that catch up to, your competitors?
Absolutely. That shaped my mind, my heart. I have the spirit of a competitor. And so I think about this in the context of life. Roadblocks are just that. You fall, get up and go. Find out like what you're doing wrong, understand your situation. But I think I am incredibly mentally tough because, look, when you're on the court for that match, you can't rely on outside coaches. You've got to fight your own battles. And I've experienced a range of those battles, and I've experienced wins when I was down, and it looked like I was down and out. And I know the joy of a comeback, and I know what that feeling is like, which is pretty great. And I've also lost matches where I've been, where I had a big lead, and I know what happens when you, no pun intended, when you take your eye off the ball.
Yeah.
I spent about a year and a half, sort of 8th and most of 9th grade at Nick Bollettieri's. Today it's IMG, but it's Nick Bollettieri's Tennis Academy then. And they were one of the first, to really point out the importance of sports psychology. And they had this incredible psychologist, Jim Lair. And at the time, I couldn't appreciate the value of the psychology around competition. And I remember they would say things like, he's not giving up. And I used to think like, of course they're not giving up. Like they're still on, what do you mean? Like, what do you throw the towel in and walk off the court? But, looking back on that and looking back on myself and understanding that whole competitive arc and what you do go through, yes, people do give up. And now I can sort of see it, if I'm watching, you kind of know if the spirit is intact. So it has been an incredibly important tool and has sharpened the way I approach, business, company building, my life. It's an experience that has really kind of created, the person I think I am today.
I couldn't agree more. And the one other experience of mine that like hearing about, wins and losses, like wins that I thought I should have won or like, and so on and so forth. Another like kind of experience that reminded me of was like in athletics, like every step of the way, you kind of like as you're progressing skill wise, you start to get into like upper echelons of skills. And that was like when I like the first time probably experienced kind of like an ego death of sorts, where I thought I was very good at this level. Yeah. And then you get introduced to the next bracket and you're just like, oh, this is what really good looks like. And it was a really humbling experience. And in that I also carry that now, where it's like, you can easily go through life just thinking you're the best at everything and you know everything. But I think back about that like kind of eye-opening experience when we got to collegiate sports, it was just like, oh, some people are just built for this. and it's okay. Like there is this like it's okay not to be the best. That's just the world. So it just reminded me of that. And I think, I probably didn't, I think fondly back on it now as a learned lesson, but probably I was like a little bit sour grapes about it when I was still playing.
Well, no, it's true. And the other thing I think that's very eye-opening is this is another translatable moment between sports and life and, executive life. The better you get at your sport, the more important coaching is, and refinement of the coaching that you're getting, and specializing that coaching. So you've got like your fitness coach, and you have your tennis coach, and you have your, I mean, it is important to work on things with the experts. And that's something that, as a young investment banker, I didn't know. I was like, well, there's just a hierarchy, and then you go from analyst to associate to whatever, you make your way through, and then you just learn. But being on, the other side, being at the management and leadership level, I value coaching as a professional, and we value it for our team as well, because you can always, there's an incredible amount that you can learn from experts who have arm's distance and can look at a situation and really see it from a very clear and studied lens.
Totally. And it reminds me of like every time we have our board meeting, it's like having your board of experts and coming in like, all right, here's everything that I'm thinking about, and just having tons of stuff to shot down. You're just like, okay. At first I have to like check my kind of emotion. I'm like, don't be offended. They probably see something I don't. And, sometimes we disagree and it's okay, but it's kind of that healthy. And that was the same thing with like athletics. Like, so what you need someone to call you out when you're just like slacking off, or you're not pulling off, you're not living up to your potential. And then that definitely carries over, at least in my business life. But, thinking about you're traveling for tennis, you're also doing school simultaneously. As you are approaching university and considering going to Columbia, was there kind of a, hey, I'm going to play collegiate tennis and also go to school, or kind of what was the considerations for you as you were approaching university?
So I got to be pretty good when I was around 16 and 17, and I actually played a few small pro tournaments. They were called satellites. It had about a $10,000 total purse. I think, I think I kind of won the qualifier to one of the first tournaments, and I played about 3 in Texas. And the school was faxing me my homework when I was away those 3 weeks. And I actually then thought I was going to play. I visited SMU in Dallas, and I was going to play at SMU because I really thought, okay, I'm definitely, there was a moment where I thought, like, I'm going to go pro, and my parents are like, no, you're going to go to college. And it was on when I was playing these small pro tournaments in Texas. I kept my amateur status, and then I visited SMU and I met with the coach there. And so I was going to go and play. And about 6 months before, I tore my rotator cuff, and it was just, my career had ended, because I think it was also very emotional, because not only did I sort of face many, many months ahead of physical therapy, but I think the emotional part came in because I felt at that point that I was just burnt out, and I didn't really want to have anything to do with the sport anymore. And I hung up my rackets. I didn't want to have anything to do with tennis at that point. So I did go to SMU. I did not play for them. And then, and then I think that's sort of when the rest of my life my life sort of changed. I wasn't a tennis player. I was a student. I was a college student. And I really started to focus then on the next layer of my life and the next phase. And, I was born in New York. And I lived in New York City till I was about 5 before we moved to Florida. My parents still sort of had friends and would come to New York often. And I always loved it. So I wanted to move back to New York City. So I transferred to Columbia in college. And that was the beginning of, the next phase of my life. And so not as a tennis player, but as a student, and just that was sort of the foundation for everything that I, then pursued in the next 20 years.
That's it. I kind of got like, it's like, oh dang, the injury that just like kind of like puts the nail in the coffin for an athlete is always so devastating. Even when, when you see a pro, like when they get taken out for a season, it's so painful to see, because it's like everything you've just like invested all the time, emotions, blood, sweat, and tears into it. But as you were, kind of transitioning from tennis and, now you're at Columbia, did you always know that you were going to study English literature? Or is that something where you're like, got there, you figured it out, figured out that this is what you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, I got there and I sort of figured it out on the spot. I mean, my mother is a writer. She's a creative. She studied classics, so was always into history, philosophy, poetry. My father was very quantitative. He was a math guy, and I grew up around commodities trading, which was his business and my grandfather's business. So, I think I had an appetite for both economics, but then also humanities. And I ended up picking my major when I got to Columbia. Columbia is famous for the core curriculum. So you actually do have to study like history of art, history of music, literature, humanities, contemporary civilizations. So there's a really kind of rich, layered classics element of your education there. And, I loved the literary part, just reading. I think it was really a gift to me to enjoy my time as a student, which was definitely on the back burner when I was a high school athlete. I didn't know or care about the Western canon, but I came to care about it and I came to love it when I was at Columbia. So I really sort of threw myself in completely.
I had a very similar experience. I ended up choosing basically biochemistry, but the Berkeley had a similar to like the core curriculum where it's like you must, like, I know this is outside of the track, but you must go experience this. And I was a little bit reluctant at first. I was like, but like, this is like, I have these, like, there's so much to do on this like bio track. Like, do I even have time? And thank God that that was a requirement, because it opened up my eyes to so much, like the breadth of like lessons learned in the humanities. Like I studied a lot of philosophy, kind of weird. It started from like a bioethics course and just kind of the bioethics of research. And then it led into like a bunch of philosophy that, and anyways, I have a great appreciation for the humanities. And I hope this kind of style of education doesn't just get thrown to the wayside for overly just like throwing the blinders on. You're now a computer scientist, or you are now a doctor.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I hope, I think about this all the time also because I have children, and I wonder / worry about, we live in a very specialized world. And I, when you say you studied biochemistry, like that would have been very useful for me in my job now. But even at RTW, where our team is about 75 people strong, we have many specialists who are super deep and bring, an incredible depth of knowledge in their own particular area. But you also need the big picture thinker. You also need a strategist. You also need someone who sees all of the moving parts. And I think, the nice thing is that it's important to know yourself, and your track shouldn't be something that is imposed on you. Like, your track should emerge really organically and authentically to what your strengths are. So now that said, like, I do think that everyone should, particularly in foundational education, like, I think it's important to get a sense of everything. And look, being a Columbia graduate, you can't really call yourself an intellectual unless you have studied, some of the classics and you have read some of the most, important works. It's also wonderful because you then begin to understand how cycles, how economic cycles, how political cycles, even in the literary world, there is almost no original thought. Like everything has happened already, right? And it's just expressing it in a new way.
I completely agree. And I think there's something to be said too about getting this breadth of exposure and then choosing to specialize afterwards, or kind of being able to flex. Like I guess what scared me about specializing too early was just not knowing, like not getting exposure elsewhere, being like, okay, this is where I want to specialize. And I there's also kind of like, we're kind of speaking in zeros and ones of like binary where you're either a generalist or a specialist, but like there's definitely you could fall somewhere in between too, where you're like,
that's right.
I can go deep, but also when I need to like flip the switch and go broad, we could do that too. And that's also a superpower in its own right. Because I think you oftentimes find, and Jake Glanville was a guest, an early guest of ours, was talking about it as like kind of like the respiratory kind of, he calls it like the respiratory system, where you get wide, you do things wide, and then you just like condense and you go down, but it's kind of this motion. And because I'll oftentimes find myself going down wormholes, just like, but those wormholes are kind of informed by like this general just curiosity on whether it be bio or finance or econ or whatever. And I think that's where a lot of very interesting ideas and investment ideas come about. So as you're kind of pursuing English literature at Columbia, I know you ended up going to a master's program in journalism. How did that come about?
Yeah, I loved writing, and then creative writing. I did some creative writing courses, and then I kind of thought that journalism was a really interesting path. I liked the idea that there is an altruistic side to it, right? You want to tell a story, you want to share information that's important. It's your way of campaigning for something, and so kind of thought that it's a great, almost humanitarian discipline. Then I realized that actually, as strong as your words may be, if you want to get things done, you kind of need to put capital behind your ideas. So I did the next best humanitarian job, which was investment banking. And I went to work at Lehman Brothers, and it was fine. I mean, it didn't necessarily matter that I didn't come out. I mean, econ, it's not like there was an undergraduate finance degree. You can come out of undergrad and be an investment banker. So much of what you do, you learn on the job anyway, and through training programs. So I think that being a journalist or being trained in that way is really important for anything. I mean, you're faced with like a mountain of information, and you have to parse through it and prioritize, like, what is it, what is really important, what's going to matter, and how do you find kind of the nugget that you want to use. What is the hook of your story, or why should a company buy an asset or sell an asset? What is the understanding of the landscape? And I think a good switched on journalistic mind can be very very effective as a banker.
Totally. And I always, in my free time, I always like reading and listening to like the folks who've made it and done it and their experience and what their backgrounds are, and lots of biographies. But I think a very common like discipline of study for very successful investors are journalists or formerly journalists. And I can't imagine that's a coincidence for how many there are. So that totally makes sense to me.
That's all for this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Stephanie Sirota. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review and share it with your friends. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to having you join us again for part 2 of our conversation with Stephanie. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceeder.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.